What you're about to experience is one man's quest to see beyond the tumultuous period we're in and to envision what lies just beyond our grasp, yet well within our reach. Welcome to Larry Rifkin's America Trends, where the future has arrived, and it's just in time.
John Krofsik and Larry Rifkin back again, registered and licensed operators of the America Trends podcast.
Yeah, I had trouble passing that test.
Wait, did we actually, John, did we get any type of license to operate and host this podcast, or should we?
Oh, that's a good question. Don't tell the FCC.
I know. Well, that's one of the great things about podcasting. There is no point of entry that you can't get into. It's true. A wide open source, at least for now, until net neutrality shuts us all down. But who knows? Who knows? But it's not such a ridiculous notion when you see what we are about to present to you today. And I would bet that if you think there's some material that we've done that may be familiar and you've heard it on other podcasts or you've read about it or what have you, I'll bet you this topic, John, people have not thought about in the way that we're going to make them think about it today.
Well, I'm certainly thinking about it.
Well, I know. You've been cogitating a lot. But when I think about it, John, I'm going to point to you. I really am. Because in my career, aside from getting some university degrees, I have never been in a profession or a calling that required that I be certified or licensed, except once when I was a kid and I got my third-class license.
I was going to say.
Well, to operate a board.
Exactly.
And I had to go to Boston. But that was really, such a minor point of entry. But you've had to get licensed.
Well, depending on if you work in state buildings, right, you're supposed to have a license for low voltage because I worked on two-way radios and stuff, So
no, but what about as a television and radio engineer?
Well, it's schooling, but
but you got a license.
Yes, well, I do, because that's required if you're going to, like I said, if you're going to work in a state building or something, you've got to be licensed for that. But otherwise, if you didn't do that type of work, you could do it without a license.
But did you get certification from professional organizations?
Yes.
Okay, so
yes.
You've had actual initials after your name?
Not actual initial, but I have actual certifications of different styles.
Okay.
Different
and by the way, folks,
groups.
SR and JR don't really account for much. All right, it's not that hard to be a dad. It's really being a father that's hard.
It is.
Starting the process is not so much. So we're not talking about those initials after your name, but we have a friend who's got all kinds of initials, as you know, behind his name. He's in commercial real estate. And you, of course, have, others in different fields. My wife and your wife, let's take them as examples, John, both in the medical sciences fields. And they have lots of initials and credentials that they've earned.
And they're licensed.
Absolutely. They have to be. One's a nurse, one's a physical therapist, and my wife's got all kinds of things, a lot of certifications because she's done Reiki and she's done specialties in lymphedema. Right. And I'm really proud because she's had a study for all of those. But the careers that I've been in, they've just been, hey, can you do this? Can you make something happen here? But there's no way that we can certify or license this, that, or the other. And even in broadcasting or even in podcasting, honestly.
It used to be in broadcast, you used to have your first-class commercial license to work on the transmitter.
Now, you had that, right?
I do. But,
all right.
But now that even the FCC says the owner is responsible for that,
So you really don't have to have that?
Not anymore, no.
Interesting.
No,
well, we're going to be delving into this issue today. And if you're listening and you're someone who is in one of these fields that in your state is licensed or certified, you're going to want to hear this conversation because it's not one size fits all, as we found out, John, in this podcast.
Yeah. To me, it's crazy that some things need license that you wouldn't think need license, and some things aren't licensed and you really think should be licensed.
Yeah, we think about health and safety, and the one that we point to here in our state of Connecticut is the fact that somehow tattoo artists, and I think those in the mortuary sciences, though as we point out in the podcast, they couldn't do a lot more damage,
well,
I guess.
right,
at that
but
point.
tattoo. I mean, if you don't clean your stuff good,
Well, you're talking about needles and
Right,
blood.
right.
I mean, you're talking about a lot of things. So some of the things are really surprising. For example, one of the things we learn in this podcast is that, well, we'll let you find out, but imagine whether you think it's the blue states or the red states that are more into this occupational licensing and may go a little bit overboard. There are areas that we talk about, like designers, interior designers, and John and I are perplexed by that one. That does require,
baffling.
I mean, in certain places. Now, the other thing, John, that I think surprised us both a lot was how little reciprocity there is. So here you've studied, you've worked, you've been in the field for 10 years, and you go across a state line, and all of a sudden you got to start all over again.
Right. Well, that's for nurses. That's how it is. I mean, depending on the state you go to, you got to get all relicensed for that other state, no matter how much knowledge you have. So, I don't know. Go figure.
It is a complex area on occupational licensing, but we find it quite interesting, and I think you will too, particularly if you're somebody who's studying. Maybe there's an apprenticeship and you're working toward some kind of license so that you can do something and really better yourself. And you'll want to hear this particular podcast. Dr. Mark Geis joins us from Quinnipiac University, and he has written a lot about this topic, and I think you're going to be a little bit surprised by some of the careers, some of the approaches in different states, and he's going to give us a really good overview of what's going on in America as it relates to both licensing and certification. And John, the one thing that I came away with is that they're both very important, but they're very different.
Yeah, no, I think in some fields they're very important. But I also noticed that Connecticut is using it as a form of tax. I've noticed these licensings keep going up every year. So it's not only that you're licensed, but your fees.
Well, it's not only for the state of Connecticut to self-aggrandize, but it's also for the profession, number one, to boost its rating and saying, hey, look how special we are, and you can't just get in willy-nilly, and to limit the pool, therefore raising the wages. So there's a lot that goes into this process, and we discussed it all with Dr. Mark Geis.
Let's find out about this.
All right. With us on the line is Dr. Mark Geis from Quinnipiac University, and he's written a piece called Waiting to Work, the Effects of Occupational Licensing on Wages and Employment. When we think about regulation, and there's a lot about over-regulation in our society, do you think this issue of licensing and perhaps even certification falls into that category?
Yes, it can, because in most states, a lot of occupations require a person to obtain a license before performing the job or their duties. And if you look at the list of occupations that most states require licenses for, some of them you'd expect that, okay, you need probably some type of training just for safety concerns or whatever. But in a lot of instances, the occupations really don't involve any type of safety issue or security or anything like that. And so a lot of them were imposed for alternative reasons. Sometimes, for example, the state imposes restrictions, usually permit fees, in order to obtain revenue. Other times they impose requirements for education or experience because the existing persons in that occupation want to limit entry into their occupation so they have less competition, if you will.
And that drives up wages, presumably.
Right. It drives up wages, exactly. So they keep the people out. One example of that, which I actually didn't study, but it's a very good example, is physical therapy. So it used to be about 20 years ago, in most states in the country, you could practice physical therapy with a bachelor's degree. 25 years ago, that was the norm. Now, in most states, you need a doctorate of physical therapy to practice, be a physical therapist, and which means about 7 years of schooling.
Well, Dr. Geis, I know this one personally because my wife is a physical therapist, and in fact, she got her master's degree at Quinnipiac University. And she looks at this as being an over requirement in terms of needing the doctorate.
Right. Yeah, and pretty much they just want to keep people out of their occupation, so it drives up their wages. I mean, it's the same thing if you think about it with accountants too. It used to be able to sit for the CPA in most states. The CPA exam in most states with a bachelor's degree, so many credits, 120 credits typically. Now in many states, it requires about 150 credits, which is the equivalent of about 5 years of college to sit for the CPA exam. And those are occupations that require college degrees, but there are many occupations that require extensive training, even that don't require any type of college degree, but they still require rather extensive training, like a fire alarm installer. Mm-hmm. In Connecticut, you need 730 days of education or experience, a combination, in order to be a fire alarm installer.
And does that strike you as being unusual? I mean, do states vary substantially in terms of the requirements they have in terms of the number of hours or the type of training for various types of occupations?
Yes, it varies quite dramatically, actually. In fact, sometimes when you look at the list of requirements, things like permit fees, experience, whatever else, I mean, they're just all over the place when it comes to what's in the top 15 or 20, if you will. There's a couple occupations that typically show up, like if you look at the top 15 or 20 most regulated occupations. Preschool teacher is one. Optician is another one. Midwife shows up there a lot of times. So does cosmetologist and barber. But the rest, it's just amazing. For example, in the state of Connecticut, one of the most onerous licenses you could get in terms of especially education, and I'm not even really sure what this person does. It's a glazier contractor. It takes over 1,800 days of education experience to get this license.
Now, in the state of Connecticut, and we live here on the two of us, but we are using this just as representative of the United States.
Right.
We're looking at conveyor operators and forest workers need to be licensed, and Connecticut makes that a requirement as the only state in the nation that puts that kind of added burden on those responsibilities.
Yes, I'm actually trying. I have the list in front of me. I'm actually trying to see how much they do list them, but I do get a conveyor operator actually 730 days to get that license in terms of experience.
That's a couple of years.
Yes.
I mean, that's pretty remarkable. And how do they justify this? I mean, I would imagine that with a lot of occupations, we're talking about health and safety. If somebody's putting chemicals into somebody's hair as a cosmetologist, there's something to that. Now, barbers may do that as well in terms of coloring. Otherwise, well, they have a pair of scissors in their hands. But, I mean, would you think that the use of chemicals versus just cutting someone's hair might create a distinction in terms of the type of training that is required?
It probably does. Also, from my understanding, cosmetology also involves other skills, if you will, besides hair coloring. Mm-hmm. And so but believe it or not, for barbers, it's actually one big reason their license is because in some states, I believe it's still true that they are allowed to use a razor to cut a hair.
Yes.
And so while a cosmetologist actually is not. And so that's a lot of the training with the razor. But it is amazing because in most of these occupations, when you read the list, you're really wondering, well, why do these have these types of burdens? One of the best examples, now Connecticut doesn't do this, but one of the best examples of a very onerous burden in terms of education and experience is actually interior designers.
Around the country. So
around the country.
How does this evidence itself? What do they require them?
There are 4 states, I believe Nevada and Florida are 2 of them. And to be an interior designer, you have to have more than 2,000 days of education, and which is a lot.
Yeah, and can you teach that much about taste and good effects in a home in 2,000 days? I mean, I don't think that's something that's easily transferable. Perhaps you have it or you don't, but I don't know. But if something was bad and came out poorly, I mean, what are the implications other than wanting to do it over again?
Right, exactly. And the thing is looking at it from a perspective of income and income potential, what you're actually doing is you're restricting individuals who do not have every opportunity in life, because a lot of these occupations do not require college degrees. They just require high school diplomas with some training. And so what you're actually doing is you're restricting people who could possibly go out and get a license or get into some type of occupation, make more money, but because they have to go through all the licensing, the permitting fees, and everything else, it makes it more onerous for them to actually pull themselves up. So they're actually making it more difficult on lower income, less educated individuals to actually make themselves better from an economic perspective.
So a lot of kids are coming out of college needing to get certified or licensed, but they've also put in so much money to get that college education. But as you're saying, there are these other fields where somebody doesn't have to go to college, incur all that debt, but at the same time, they are incurring a lot of time and resource to become validated in a particular field.
Right, and if there's no real safety or security concern, we're restraining them from becoming more productive, making more money, essentially.
What about licensure versus certification? Because there is a difference.
Yes, and licensure implies that the person has to get the license to perform that particular occupation or task. Certification means that the person does not have to actually get certified to perform that certain occupation, but they could call themselves certified then. So in my research, I only looked at occupations that actually required licensing, because certification really doesn't impose a burden, if you will, because a person could still do it. It's just that they couldn't call themselves certified, if you will.
And there are many organizations that have sprung up around a lot of different pursuits where they say, well, if you're not certified by this professional organization or another, then you're less certified to do Reiki or to do this, that, or the other. So a lot of these voluntary activities have sprung up, correct?
Right, and a lot of those are not government mandated at all.
Mm-hmm.
They're strictly private organizations that claim that that whoever they certify will be better at their task or occupation. But that's different. Licensure is actually government mandated, either training or experience or permitting fees in order to perform an occupation. That's much more of an onerous burden than just having a certification.
And all of the studies that you have pointed to in the report that I gathered from you have found that licensing restrains entry into occupations, and that allows the licensees to increase prices to consumers and thus increase wages. So is this something that is promulgated at the beginning by professional organizations or by unions? Who really starts the ball rolling on requiring licensure? How do you see that coming about in many cases?
Well, it depends really on a variety of factors, including what state you're talking about and so on and so forth. If you go back decades, like many, many decades, a lot of occupations, a lot of licensing for occupations started, for example, in the South, unfortunately, in order to keep African Americans from entering those occupations.
Mm.
So it had some racial, and this was like 80, 100 years ago, a long, long time ago. And then as the time went on, more and more was the professions going to the state legislature saying, listen, We want people to, we want people to get or licensed in our particular occupation because we don't want everybody getting into our field and so on and so forth. And it's an ancient thing. Is if you think about it, back in the Middle Ages, they used to have guilds where if you were a blacksmith, you had to belong to a certain guild. Otherwise, you couldn't say you were a blacksmith and so on and so forth. And so this licensing phenomena has been around for literally centuries, probably. And the big issue now, though, is, in my mind, it's more of an income inequality issue because there is rising income inequality in our country, and one way to actually kind of put a dent in that income inequality is to allow individuals, especially those individuals at the lower end of the economic spectrum, to have more opportunities to earn more money, to gain skills and so on and so forth, but licensing, occupational licensing, is restraining that. And I think people are finally kind of waking up to this. At least I hope they are.
Well, as we're looking at regulation, over-regulation, under-regulation, whether in fact we're going to start paring back some of these areas, like interior designers, or I know one that you talked about, certain states' travel agents must be licensed. Now, they can send you to the wrong place, and it can be a bad experience. I had that happen once. But now everybody's taking travel into their own hands, doing it online. I mean, it does seem a bit weighty in terms of that requirement. And so are we going to get back to a time when we look seriously at safety and health issues and needing certain skills so that a job is not totally bollocksed and has an impact on people? For example, one area that I know you and I discussed at one point was about tattoo artists. And that would seem to have a real health implication, and yet states that like to regulate a lot of things, like Connecticut, had virtually no regulation on the tattoo industry.
It's very inconsistent. And one way to solve a lot of these problems is actually to have statewide or state-level reciprocity of licenses. So if you're licensed, for example, as a preschool teacher in one state, then other states should accept that license. And so we're actually kind of working towards that. In fact, I've been recently asked to join the Occupational Licensing Policy Learning Consortium from the National Governors Association.
Interesting.
And we're actually going to look at occupational licensing and see if reciprocity, state-level reciprocity, would actually help in alleviating some of that regulatory burden. Should we look at more issues, as you mentioned, in terms of safety and health? So should some states actually possibly regulate some occupations more and some occupations less? So we're going to be looking at it from a broader perspective because it is a regulatory burden, and I mean you don't want to impede anybody from earning a living, and this probably is impeding certain people from doing that.
Dr. Mark Geis is with us from Quinnipiac University, and we're talking about licensure, and this is not something that is an over-regulatory environment from the federal government. These licenses are basically state-derived. Is that correct in general?
Yes, that's correct. There's very few, if any, federal licensing. There's some things, but it's almost all at state level. Some cities, some larger cities, also have their own licensing. Because I believe New York and Los Angeles does independent licensing of certain occupations, but that's not very common at all. So it's primarily a state-level problem. And also I'd like to say that it's very interesting because you'd figure that it would break out along ideological fault lines.
Yeah, blue-red.
Right.
You know?
So you'd figure that blue states would have much more regulation, much more occupational licensing than red states. And really, depending on how you measure it, there's a lot of blue states actually fare better than a lot of red states in this way. For example, at I believe it's the Institute for Justice, which is a somewhat right-wing think tank, but they did a study on occupational licensing, very well done. And Connecticut actually, in terms of the burden, was ranked 39th out of 50th. So we were not that as as burdensome as you thought we would be. You know.
What about some of the southern states?
Well,
I mean,
Louisiana is one of the worst, which is a red state, and Louisiana is pretty tough when it comes to regulatory requirements. Now, some of this, I mean, could possibly be a throwback to the days many, many decades ago when occupations were licensed to keep certain people out, and they just didn't want to do that. And some of these are holdovers because a lot of these laws are not really reformed very often. They're kind of on the books, and they just stay there, and nobody really looks at them or does anything to them unless people rise up. And the issue is the people who are being hurt by these laws, they typically don't have the resources to do anything about it. While the occupations the people that benefit from these laws definitely have the resources to defend these laws because they usually have professional associations and everything else, and so they could go to the state capitol and say, hey, you cannot remove these occupational licenses, or they're there for the consumer. They always use the consumer. They're there for the consumer's protection. You can't remove this. It's the only way we could protect the consumers and the citizens of the state. And while the people who are being hurt by it sometimes don't even realize they're being hurt by it because they can't get into the occupation to begin with, or they just don't have the resources to.
We'll return to this episode of America Trends in just a moment. If you like what we're doing here at America Trends Podcast, please don't keep it to yourself. I know there are a lot of people, John, who think, well, if I'm listening and somebody else wants to listen at the same time, maybe we're going to collide and they're not going to be able to hear us. Yeah. Is that the way the technology works?
No, there's plenty of bandwidth. Everybody can listen at the same time.
All right. Well, that dispels that myth. Now, you can do a number of things that would really be helpful to us. You could give us a kind rating or a review at Apple Podcasts, and that boosts what they consider to be our value and visibility. And what does that do, John?
Well, that puts us in the forefront so that you can find us easier, and most important is other people can find us easier.
And you can subscribe there or on our site, americatrendspodcast.com, or wherever you're listening, so we can alert you to new episodes of the podcast, which, by the way, we put out twice a week on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And stay in touch with us on both Facebook and Twitter at Trends Podcast. Or you can like us on Facebook or follow us where, John?
On Twitter.
On Twitter, that's right, where the world turns to hear fake news or whatever it is. Well, you can direct message us at Trends Podcast or using hashtag Trends Podcast. And you know, John, with our growing audience, and really it's been pretty remarkable, a lot of people just came to us the last month or two, and they might have missed earlier episodes. Can they get them again?
They can look through them and pick the ones they want to listen to. They're all on the website, and a lot of them are up on iTunes, many of them.
All right. Well, listen, there's lots of material to listen to. We hope you have the time, and we'll lend it to us because we try to make it worth your while. And thanks so much for listening.
And tell your friends.
We now return to this episode of America Trends. Have you seen, as an economist, that there are certain of these licensure requirements that really have thrown the price-benefit equation out the window? In other words, where you see a certain profession that has locked out so many people because of onerous hours and training and the like, that the price for some things just really doesn't make any sense, except to say that there's just a limited number of people available to perform the task.
Typically, what most studies have observed, because there's been lots of research done on this with many different occupations, usually the way most studies have looked at is they've looked at either compared employment levels in states that have occupational licensing, states that don't, and then they compare the wages of the occupations in states that have licensing and states that don't. Typically, the premium paid because of occupational licensing is around 5 to 6%. It could be a little bit higher in certain states. Believe it or not, opticians benefit pretty much from occupational licensing. I don't know if we want to remove that regulatory burden too much, but they benefit pretty much from it. But usually it's about 5-6%. And then the drop in employment, like you would see fewer people in a certain occupation because of licensing, is probably a little bit more. That's maybe about 10% around there. But it's not as onerous. It's onerous and it keeps people out, but it's not like 20, 30, 40.
Right. I mean, do we think that some of these requirements, even if we can't quite understand them, do give us a consumer benefit, that this person just has a bit more know-how, a bit more skill because they had to take the time and take the requirements?
Well, no, I think for some of these occupations, yes, I think they would require some. They should require some type of licensing, like midwife, and usually things associated with the healthcare field. They would probably need some type of regulatory regulation, some type of occupational licensing. I guess my big issue is with some occupations, like we mentioned, travel agent or interior decorator, where really there is no health issue or safety issue regarding it, that you probably could eliminate those types of regulations. And thankfully, I think we're moving more to that. It's actually getting easier in some states to obtain these licenses. In some states now, for example, a lot of the exams that you may have to take to obtain a license are now available online. So it's not like you have to show up any particular place. You can just take it online. A lot of permitting fees can be paid online, so on and so forth. So states are getting better at making the burden less onerous. But I think there's still room for improvement. But I do agree with you that there's certain occupations, obviously, you don't want to remove any type, or you don't want to lessen the licensure requirements that much because of some type of health or safety is concerned.
Now, what about the issue of reciprocity? You raised it earlier. So if I'm licensed to do something in the state I live in and I move across the state's borders, how generally is that received and accepted as being proof enough that I'm capable, or do I have to test again?
Typically, as it stands now in most states, for most occupations, you would have to test again. You would not be allowed to carry your license over. You would actually have to retake the tests and everything else, which is one big issue with occupational licensing. In fact, that's part of one of the things we're going to look at in this consortium of several states by the National Governors Association. Is we want to see, should we impose reciprocity so that if you have a license to perform a certain occupation in Connecticut and you move to Massachusetts, you could do it. The other issue too is what if you live right on the border? So if you're in Connecticut and you have a license, should you be allowed to drive over the border and perform that occupation in Massachusetts?
Exactly.
Right now, you really can't.
And, think about it. As a mobile society, and one that loves to think that the great wide open is available to us from sea to shining sea, or shore to shining shore, or whatever it is, this is restrictive in terms of those abilities to kind of move about and be free to do so.
Yes, exactly. And so it greatly restricts people's mobility, because if they don't want to move, because they realize they won't be able to continue on with their occupation. So that's one issue we really want to look at. Plus, it opens up more competition, because if you're if you're in a certain occupation, you live in Connecticut, right now you cannot. If it's a licensed occupation, you can't drive across the border and perform that in Massachusetts or Rhode Island or New York. So it's actually keeping competition down in that particular area. But if you can go drive across the border, then all of a sudden, and all the customers have more people to pick from, and hopefully find somebody who could better suit their needs, or in terms of what type of job they want conducted.
Absolutely. I know we're talking primarily about licensure, but I would imagine that in the field of certification, the area that gets a lot of attention and a lot of people want to protect it, want to make certain that it's sacred and limited, is teaching. And yet there are so many alternative paths that now are being built in different places because they lack the individuals who are going to be able to perform in the classroom with a lot of knowledge of the subject, particularly in STEM fields like science, technology, engineering, and math.
No, I agree with you, yes. And once again, that's an issue. Now, the teacher certification, especially in most states, is somewhat similar to licensing. So, for example, not all states recognize, not all other states, teaching certification. So, typically the government certificate, for example, in the state of Connecticut, you have to be essentially a certified teacher or progressing towards that in order to teach in a school, especially in a public school in Connecticut. Now, there are many certification programs out there where you don't actually have to have the certification to actually perform that occupation. So those are much less onerous than, let's say, the teacher certification. I would equate more the teacher certification. That's almost a licensure, if you will, because you really have to have it in order to teach in schools.
So you write that if licensing acts as a barrier to entry, then it is reasonable to assume that states with occupational licensing will have lower per capita employment and higher wages for the licensed occupation. Does that hold true?
For the occupations I examined, it was true for most of them. I unfortunately could not look at many occupations because basically I wanted to look at occupations that were licensed in most states. So I had some data points to look at, and as I said, it varied quite dramatically. But it actually did. It actually increased. What I looked at is it increased wages for bartenders, child care workers, crane operators, and opticians. Opticians, as I said, if you remember, they benefited quite greatly from this. And it reduced employment sort of lower levels of individuals in these occupations in the licensed states for opticians, pharmacy technicians, taxi drivers, teachers' assistants, and veterinary technicians.
I was talking to somebody who's a liberal politician, and we were talking about certain requirements in the state of Connecticut, and he was surprised to learn from someone, it was at a funeral actually, how limited the requirements were in the mortuary sciences in a state like ours. And he laughingly said, we'll have to do something about that. But I'm wondering if mortuary sciences is one that gets a lot of attention.
Actually, no, because like you said, it's not really, it doesn't have a lot of occupational requirements, to be honest with you, and I'm actually just quickly looking at my list.
Well, I guess they can't do any more harm, I guess, if we want to look at it that way.
Well, no, but the problem is actually you do want to have some regulation of mortuary industry because there have been instances of where funeral home directors actually were improperly disposing of bodies or improperly cremating remains or returning the wrong remains. So you do want to have some, but it actually varies, and there's no rhyme or reason, unfortunately, to this occupational licensing. There's some occupations like mortician. You'd figure you would have at least some level of regular licensing for this, and it's very minimal, to be honest with you. And then others that you wouldn't even think would really require it or not require very much, and yet there's a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, apropos to the title of our podcast, America Trends, what do you think is an overarching trend? Is it toward more consolidation of some of these requirements among states, more in the reciprocity? Is it limiting it to certain fields? What do you see happening if we could take a 30,000-foot view?
Oh, I think we're definitely moving towards having more consistent occupational licensing and much more reciprocity. I think even politicians, I'll be honest with you, I'm a Democrat, and even politicians on the left, or some of us anyway, realize that, this is an economic issue. It doesn't make any sense to prevent people from entering these occupations, especially if it's going to better them and help them, climb the economic ladder. We actually want that. We want to encourage that. So I definitely see a move towards more reciprocity, more review of these occupational licensing requirements. Are they really necessary? Do they really help consumer welfare, or are they just there to prop up the wages of a particular profession? It's going to be an uphill battle because, like I said, some of these professions have professional societies that really want to keep these occupational licensing requirements intact. So that's going to be the biggest problem.
Occupational insulation. If there was one field that you looked at, looking throughout the United States, that might shock someone because there's a licensing requirement related to it, maybe we can leave on kind of a jocular note. Is there one that you would point to?
Really, we already mentioned it, unfortunately, but it's that cracks me up is the interior decorator for over 2,000 hours of training, just so you could paint somebody's walls and pick out drapes.
Well, I do think they should be licensed if they're going to have their own show on HGTV.
Well, the funny thing is they're probably not, because, like I said, the states that really have that big the onerous requirements are like Nevada, Florida. I think, believe it or not, Washington, D.C. does too, which kind of makes sense because what happens there is people move in and out a lot, and so they hire a lot of decorators. So the decorator, it's a strong field in those areas, and so they want to protect their little piece of the pie, if you will. But that's the classic example of total unnecessary.
Well, and also conveyor operators and forest workers. Well, listen, I want to thank you so much for coming by today. Mark Geis, a fascinating topic that I don't think many people have considered, but we are today on America Trends. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks for listening to this episode of America Trends.